The crack of gunfire shattered the desert silence as bullets peppered the faded stucco walls of the Desert Oasis Motel. Inside room 12, Frank Delaney dropped to the floor with the fluid instinct of a man who'd done it 1,000 times before. His weathered hands found the duffel bag under the bed in one smooth motion. Contact front. Multiple vehicles, at least 12 tangos approaching from the east, called out a gravelly voice from the room next door. Frank's eyes narrowed as he peered through the gap in the curtains. Black SUVs with tinted windows had formed a half circle around the motel's dusty parking lot. Men in tactical gear poured out, their weapons glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. "They picked the wrong reunion to crash," Frank muttered, unzipping the bag to reveal what no ordinary motel owner would possess. If you believe in stories that celebrate bravery and honor, subscribe now and join us. There's plenty more heroism ahead. The Desert Oasis Motel sat like a mirage on the edge of nowhere, 20 miles from the Mexican border and at least 40 from anything resembling civilization. Its faded neon sign hadn't fully lit up in years, but Frank kept the place running as much for the privacy as for the modest income it provided. Most importantly, it gave him somewhere to host the annual gathering that had kept him sane for the past 40 years. Room by room, the other men inside shifted into a familiar rhythm. No panic, no shouting, just the methodical movements of those who'd faced worse odds in the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia decades ago. These men, now in their 70s with silver hair and lined faces, moved with a purpose that belied their age. "Thompson, Madison, secure the rear exit," Frank ordered through the walkie-talkie they'd brought for their fishing trip that would never happen now. "Martinez, get to the roof." Jenkins and Wilson barricaded the lobby. Outside, a man stepped forward from the lead vehicle. His expensive suit looked out of place against the desert backdrop. He raised a megaphone to his lips. "We know who you are," his voice boomed across the parking lot. Accent thick, but English precise. "The territory you are on now belongs to the Sinaloa Cartel. You have 2 minutes to surrender the package and the witness." Frank exchanged glances with Doc Reynolds, who'd been his medic in the Mekong Delta. Neither man knew what package the cartel was talking about. As for witnesses, the only people inside were 7 Vietnam veterans who'd answered their country's call half a century ago. "Must be a mistake," Doc whispered, pressing his back against the wall as he checked the handgun he'd brought for target shooting. "No mistake," Frank replied, the desert heat suddenly feeling like the humid air of Vietnam in his memory. "They tracked someone here. Someone they want bad enough to send an assault team." The desert wind kicked up, swirling dust around the cartel vehicles. In the distance, heat waves distorted the horizon, making the approaching reinforcements look like ghosts rising from the earth. Frank could smell the familiar scent of gun oil as his old unit, a group that had survived the worst the Viet Cong could throw at them, prepared for a fight they never expected to face on American soil. Frank's hand brushed against the worn military dog tags he still wore under his shirt. The cool metal grounded him, connecting him to the young Marine he'd once been. Now, 50 years later, he and his brothers-in-arms were being called to action one more time. 2 minutes, senors, the cartel leader shouted again. Frank picked up his walkie-talkie. "Sierra Hotel, gentlemen," he said, using the old military phonetic for SH, shit hot, their signal for combat readiness. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation." 7 acknowledgments crackled back in rapid succession. The reunion had begun normally enough 3 days earlier. Frank had stood at the entrance of the Desert Oasis Motel, watching dust trails appear on the horizon as familiar vehicles approached one by one. The tradition had started in '85, a way to keep the nightmares at bay by surrounding themselves with the only people who truly understood. By sunset on the first day, all 7 had arrived. Martinez was first as always, the former radio operator's punctuality unchanged since Vietnam. Then came Doc Reynolds, Thompson and his oxygen tank, Wilson with his prosthetic leg, Jenkins with a new hearing aid, and finally Madison, who still moved like the point man he'd been in the jungle despite his arthritis. The first sign of trouble came at dawn on day 2. Frank had always been an early riser, a habit the war had burned into him. He was making coffee in the small kitchenette behind the reception desk when he noticed a black SUV with tinted windows crawling past the motel, much too slowly for the empty desert highway. Tourists get lost out here sometimes, he muttered to himself, but his gut tightened in that familiar way it used to before an ambush. When the same vehicle passed by again an hour later, Frank mentioned it to Martinez, who was helping him fix a leaky faucet in room 8. Coincidence? Martinez suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe it. Maybe, Frank replied. Let's keep our eyes open. By midday, 2 more identical SUVs had driven past. During their barbecue lunch behind the motel, Frank quietly briefed the others. No one panicked. These men had faced uncertainty before. But the easy laughter of the reunion gained an edge, and conversations began to include casual mentions of sight lines and defensive positions. Thompson, who'd worked border patrol after Vietnam until his lungs gave out, made a call to an old colleague. Manny says the Sinaloa cartel has been pushing into this territory, Thompson reported, rejoining the group. There's been some leadership change, and the new lieutenant wants to establish routes through this county. They've been scouting locations. Any reason they'd be interested in this place specifically? Jenkins asked, his fingers absently tapping a rhythm on his thigh, the same rhythm he'd tapped out on his rifle stock before operations. Frank considered this. The desert oasis sat at the junction of 2 rarely used county roads, with good visibility in all directions. It was remote enough to avoid attention, but accessible enough to serve as a waypoint. Locations good for their purposes, Frank admitted. But they usually bribe owners, not surveil them. Doc Reynolds, who'd run a medical clinic in El Paso for years, cleared his throat. There's another possibility. 3 days ago, a young woman came into my clinic with suspicious injuries. Looked like she'd been held somewhere against her will. When I called the police, she panicked and ran. She mentioned heading east this direction. The men exchanged glances. A potential witness on the run from the cartel who might have sought shelter at the most isolated motel in the region would explain the surveillance. Anyone check in that matches that description? Madison asked. Frank shook his head. Just the usual, truckers, couples needing privacy. Although, he paused, remembering. Room 14. Young woman. Paid cash for 3 nights. Barely had any luggage. Checked in yesterday, right before you all arrived. You get a name? Martinez asked. Maria Diaz. Seemed nervous, but I figured it was just being alone out here. Wilson, who'd been quietly cleaning his glasses, spoke up. We need to verify if she's who they're looking for without spooking her. If the cartel's watching, they've seen us all arrive. They might think she's connected to us somehow. As the veterans considered their options, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, a vehicle approaching fast from the south. Get inside, Frank ordered. Casual, but be ready. The men dispersed, moving unhurriedly back to their rooms while keeping the approaching vehicle in their peripheral vision. Frank remained at the grill, flipping burgers as if he didn't have a care in the world. The vehicle, a dusty pickup truck with Sonora plates, screeched to a halt in the parking lot. 2 men got out, making no effort to hide the pistols tucked into their waistbands. Late 20s, with the hard eyes and alert posture of predators. They glanced around the property, taking note of the veterans' vehicles. Help you, gentlemen? Frank called from the grill, his voice friendly but his eyes cold. Looking for my sister, the taller one said in accented English. She might have stopped here. Young, pretty, driving a blue Honda. Frank shook his head. No blue Honda here. Just these old trucks and my guest vehicles. The men surveyed the motel with obvious skepticism. Your guests. Old men having a party? Vietnam reunion, Frank said, gesturing to his USS Coral Sea Cap. We get together once a year, tell the same old stories, complain about our joints. The shorter man snorted with thinly veiled contempt. You mind if we look around? Just to be sure my sister isn't here. I mind very much, Frank said, his smile unchanged but his posture subtly shifting. "This is private property, and my guests value their privacy. If your sister turns up, who should I say was looking for her?" The men stared at Frank for a long moment, measuring him. Frank stared back, the smile still fixed on his face, but his eyes holding the same steady gaze that had once watched enemy movements through jungle foliage for hours without blinking. "Hernandez," the taller one finally said. "Tell her her brothers are worried." They climbed back into their truck, but didn't leave immediately. Instead, they made a show of writing something down, clearly wanting Frank to think they were recording license plate numbers. As soon as the truck disappeared down the highway, Frank went to room 14 and knocked. There was no answer. "Clear," Martinez called from around the corner. He'd positioned himself to watch for any unexpected visitors. Frank used his master key. The room was empty, the bed unmade, a bus ticket to Tucson on the nightstand, and the bathroom window open wide. "She bolted," Frank said as the others joined him. "Smart girl." "They'll be back," Thompson said, his breathing labored even with his oxygen. "With friends," Jenkins added grimly. The veterans gathered in Frank's back office, a small room behind the reception desk where he kept the motel's ancient computer and filing cabinets. On the wall hung a faded map of the county and, beside it, a topographical map that Frank used for his occasional hiking trips. "First thing we need to do is find the girl," Frank said. "If she left on foot, she's in trouble. Nearest town is 40 miles, and the desert will kill her before she makes it halfway." "She might have hitched with a passing truck," Doc suggested. "Maybe," Frank conceded. "But we can't count on that. Martinez, Jenkins, take my truck and check the bus station in Tucson. See if she made it there. Thompson, you still have contacts in Border Patrol?" Thompson nodded. "I'll make some calls, get patrols looking for her. Madison, Wilson, I need you to make a supply run. Food, water, medical. Doc's inventory list. Make it look routine, just two old vets grabbing supplies. They'll have someone watching the store," Wilson pointed out. "Count on it," Frank agreed. "So make sure they see you buying normal stuff. The essentials go in the hidden compartment under Thompson's wheelchair in the back." Madison grinned. "Just like smuggling ammo past the camp inspectors." "I'll stay here with Doc and Thompson," Frank continued. "We'll secure the perimeter and take inventory of what we have for defense." After the others left, Frank, Doc, and Thompson systematically checked every room, corner, and potential entry point of the motel. The desert oasis wasn't built for defense. The single-story structure formed a rough shape around the central parking lot, with rooms opening directly to the outside. The office and Frank's living quarters anchored one end, and a small conference room that he rented out for the occasional local business meeting sat at the other. "Visibility's good," Thompson noted, wheezing slightly as they walked the property. "No approach without being seen." "Too many entry points, though," Frank countered, eyeing the numerous windows and doors. "And these walls won't stop anything bigger than a .22. "What's our inventory?" Doc asked. Frank led them to his living quarters and opened a gun safe hidden behind a landscape painting. "2 shotguns, my .45, and a hunting rifle," he listed, "plus whatever the others brought. Martinez always has his 9mm, and I know Madison carries." "Not exactly an arsenal," Doc observed dryly. "We've managed with less," Frank reminded him. "Thompson, how many do you think we're facing?" Thompson, who'd been studying the vehicles that had driven past, frowned. "Based on the pattern, I'd say they have at least 3 vehicles. Standard Cartel tactical team runs 46 men per vehicle, so somewhere between 12 and 18. Frank nodded grimly. "Outgunned and outnumbered. Just like old times," Doc said with a hint of gallows humor. They spent the next hour improvising reinforcements for the most vulnerable areas. Frank's maintenance shed provided materials to board up rear windows and create makeshift barriers. They positioned furniture to create choke points and identified the most defensible rooms. When Martinez and Jenkins returned from Tucson, their faces told the story before they spoke. "She never made it to the bus station," Martinez reported. But we found something else. There's cartel graffiti all over the bus station bathroom. Fresh. They're marking territory. This isn't just about the girl, Jenkins added. The word in town is that Sinaloa is making a big push into Arizona. They're establishing presence everywhere, including transportation hubs. They're sending a message, Frank concluded. And we're in their way. Madison and Wilson returned an hour later with the supplies and more news. Town's crawling with them, Madison said as they unloaded bottled water and canned food. Pairs of men in black SUVs at every gas station and diner. They're watching all the roads. The guy at the hardware store told me 3 local business owners were visited yesterday, Wilson added, told to expect new partners in their operations. Frank processed this, the tactical part of his brain, dormant for decades but never truly gone, assessing angles and options. They'll make a show of force soon, he predicted. Probably tonight. Hit us when they think we're sleeping, use us as an example to scare the other holdouts in the region. And the girl? Doc asked. Secondary target now, Frank said. We've become the primary. A motel full of old vets who didn't immediately roll over were the message they want to send. As sunset approached, they made final preparations. Every veteran had slipped back into their old combat roles with practiced ease. Martinez established communications with walkie-talkies, creating a channel for the motel and a backup frequency. Madison identified fields of fire and defensive positions. Doc prepared a medical station in the central room. Thompson, despite his oxygen tank, plotted likely enemy movements on Frank's topographical map. Wilson and Jenkins distributed the weapons and improvised more from tools and materials around the motel. Frank watched them work with a mixture of pride and sadness. These old warriors deserved their peace. Instead, they were preparing for battle on American soil against an enemy who didn't yet realize what they were facing, not just old men, but ghosts of the soldiers they had once been, Marines who had survived the crucible of Vietnam through brotherhood, skill, and sheer stubborn will. Night fell across the desert, bringing a heavy stillness broken only by the occasional call of a coyote. The veterans took up their positions, Martinez and Thompson in Frank's office with sight lines to the highway, Madison and Wilson covering the rear approaches, Jenkins monitoring the flanks, and Doc ready to move wherever needed. Frank made one final round, checking on each man, exchanging nods and half-smiles that communicated more than words could. When he returned to the front, he stared out at the dark highway, remembering another night, decades ago, when they had waited for an enemy to emerge from the darkness. He wondered if the cartel men approaching through the desert knew what they were walking into. Frank, Martinez's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie. Vehicle approaching from the south. Lights off. Copy. Frank responded, feeling the familiar calm of combat readiness settle over him. All stations, prepare for contact. 3 black SUVs approached the Desert Oasis Motel with headlights off, guided only by the ambient glow of a quarter moon. They formed a loose semicircle in the parking lot, engines still running. Frank counted 12 men emerging from the vehicles, moving with the coordinated precision of those accustomed to violence. Hold positions, Frank whispered into his walkie-talkie. No one fires unless I give the order. The cartel men spread out, taking cover behind vehicles. One man, clearly in charge, stepped forward. Even in the dim light, Frank could make out his expensive leather jacket and the golden glint of a heavy watch on his wrist. My name is Alejandro Vega, the man called out, his voice echoing across the empty parking lot. I represent certain business interests in this region. We know you are harboring someone who has taken something that belongs to us. Return her and what she stole, and you can return to your reunion. Frank reached for the motel's ancient PA system, originally installed to call guests about phone calls in the days before cell phones. This is Frank Delaney, owner of the Desert Oasis. There's no one here but my guests, veterans of the Vietnam War. Whatever you're looking for, it's not here. I suggest you leave private property before the county sheriff gets involved. A sharp laugh cut through the night. The sheriff? He understands our arrangement. No one is coming to help you, old man. The cartel leader signaled, and two of his men approached a vacant room at the end of the row. They kicked in the door, flashlight beams sweeping the interior. Sierra 2, targets approaching your position, Frank warned, using their old squad designations. Copy that, Sierra 1, Madison replied, his voice steady. I have eyes on them. The men moved to the next room, kicking in another door. Frank knew they would methodically search every room until they found what they were looking for, or realized it wasn't there. Either way, violence would follow. Last chance, senor, Vega called out. Send out the girl and the package, or we start shooting old soldiers. Frank had positioned himself in the office with a clear view of the parking lot. The familiar weight of his .45 rested in his hand, a companion from his Marine days that he'd kept clean and functional through the decades. We can end this peacefully, Frank responded through the PA. There's no girl here. You've been misinformed. Even as he spoke, Frank saw movement at the edge of the property, a figure slipping between shadows toward the conference room at the far end of the motel. Through the darkness, he could just make out the slim silhouette of a young woman. Maria had never left after all. Sierra 3, movement at your 9 o'clock, Frank whispered urgently. Possible friendly. I see her, Jenkins confirmed. Bringing her in. On the walkie-talkie, Frank heard Jenkins's hushed voice urging the woman to hurry inside. Moments later, Jenkins reported, package secure. She says there are more coming. At least 20 more men on the way. Frank's mind raced through scenarios, none of them good. They were outnumbered and outgunned, with limited ammunition and compromised positions. The smart play was retreat, but the nearest backup was at least an hour away, and the open desert offered little cover. In the parking lot, Vegas seemed to be losing patience. He barked orders in Spanish, and his men began to take more aggressive positions, weapons now openly displayed. They're setting up a firing line, Martinez observed from his position. Standard intimidation tactic. Frank's mind flashed back to a night outside Da Nang in '68. Their unit pinned down in an abandoned village, VC closing in from 3 sides. They'd survived by using the darkness, superior position knowledge, and making the enemy believe they faced a much larger force. Sierra Team, implement Diamond Dust, Frank ordered, invoking one of their old battlefield strategies. The veterans acknowledged with single clicks on their walkies, their signal for silent confirmation. Within seconds, flashlight beams began flicking on and off from different points around the motel, appearing, disappearing, and reappearing in new locations. Some were actual flashlights. Others were improvised reflections from mirrors catching the moonlight. In the parking lot, the cartel men reacted with confusion, their attention drawn to the multiple light sources, making it impossible to determine how many defenders they faced or where they were positioned. What is this? Vega demanded, anger edging into his voice. How many are in there? Frank didn't respond, instead watching as his old unit executed the decades-old tactic with perfect coordination. Thompson triggered the motel's outdoor lights to flash on and off, further disorienting the attackers. Martinez had rigged a portable speaker to play recorded footsteps and hushed voices that seemed to come from the darkness behind the cartel position. Sierra 7 to Sierra 1, the girl has information. Doc's voice came through the walkie-talkie. She says they're after a hard drive with financial records. She worked as a cleaner at one of their safe houses and grabbed it when she overheard them planning to eliminate witnesses. Does she have it? Frank asked. Negative. Says she hid it in town before coming here. That's why she was trying to sneak out, to retrieve it as leverage for safe passage to the authorities. Before Frank could respond, a burst of gunfire shattered the night. One of the more anxious cartel soldiers had fired at a moving shadow, triggering a cascade of shots from his companions. Bullets thudded into the walls of the motel, sending splinters of wood and stucco flying. Hold fire. Frank ordered his men. Let them waste ammunition. But the restraint ended when Wilson's pained voice came over the radio. Sierra 4 is hit. Not critical, but I'm bleeding. Doc acknowledged he was moving to Wilson's position. Frank felt a familiar cold anger crystallize in his chest. He'd led these men through hell once before, promised their families he'd bring them home. He'd be damned if he'd lose any of them now to cartel thugs on American soil. Sierra Team, switch to Broken Arrow Protocol, Frank commanded, referencing the defensive strategy they developed when surrounded in hostile territory. Precise fire, confirmed targets only. Make every shot count. Thompson, despite his oxygen tank, had positioned himself at a window with Frank's hunting rifle. At Frank's order, he carefully sighted the cartel man who had fired first and squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack of the rifle was followed by a cry from the parking lot as the man fell. Martinez, from his concealed position on the roof, targeted the floodlights on one of the SUVs, plunging half the parking lot into darkness. In the confusion, Madison used the shotgun to disable a second vehicle, shredding its tires with a blast that echoed across the desert. The coordinated response momentarily stunned the cartel men, who had clearly expected to face frightened old men, not disciplined return fire. They scrambled for better cover, several retreating toward the remaining functional SUV. They're regrouping, Frank observed. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they come back harder. Sierra 1, this is Sierra 3, Jenkins called. The girl says there's something else. The hard drive has locations of underground tunnels they're using for trafficking. That's why they want it back so badly. It's their whole northern operation. Frank processed this information. What had seemed like an isolated incident now fit into a larger pattern. The cartel's aggressive expansion, the territorial markings, the corruption of local officials. They were establishing a major smuggling route, and the desert oasis sat at a crucial junction. Through the window, Frank saw Vega on a satellite phone, gesturing angrily as he called for reinforcements. The cartel leader's eyes locked with Frank's across the distance, and Frank saw something shift in the man's expression, the dawning realization that he wasn't facing ordinary civilians. Vega raised his hand in a signal, and the remaining cartel men fell back to defensive positions. The first assault had failed, but Frank knew this was just the opening move. The real attack would come soon. Sierra Team, rally point Charlie, Frank ordered, designating the central hallway connecting the back offices to the main building. One by one, the veterans converged on the location, moving with the caution of men who understood that panic was deadlier than bullets. Wilson arrived with Doc supporting him, a bloodstained bandage around his upper arm. Flesh wound, Wilson reported with grim humor. Doc says I'll live to collect my pension. Martinez was the last to arrive, having descended from the roof through a maintenance hatch. They've pulled back about 50 yards, setting up a perimeter. I count 15 now, 3 new arrivals while we were keeping their friends busy. Frank nodded, his mind already mapping the tactical situation. They're waiting for reinforcements. The girl says 20 more are coming, and I believe her. Once they arrive, they'll hit us from all sides. The veterans gathered around the small table where Frank had spread out the motel's layout. The young woman, Maria, hung back nervously, her eyes wide with a combination of fear and disbelief as she watched these older men calmly discussing battle strategies. Jenkins, what's our ammunition situation? Frank asked. Shotgun has 12 shells left. Hunting rifle has 7 rounds. Martinez has maybe 20 for the 9mm. Your .45 has 2 full magazines. Plus whatever Wilson and Madison brought. Revolvers with maybe 12 rounds each. Not enough for a prolonged firefight, Frank concluded. We need to be smarter than that. We could try to slip out the back, make it to the county highway, Thompson suggested, his breathing labored but his mind still sharp. Frank shook his head. They'll have that covered by now. And even if we got past them, we'd be exposed in open desert with limited mobility. He glanced meaningfully at Thompson's oxygen tank and Wilson's bandaged arm. What about calling for help? Maria asked, speaking for the first time. Surely someone, Cell service out here is spotty at best, Martinez explained gently. And Frank's landline was cut just before they arrived. The sheriff's in their pocket, Madison added. And border patrols stretched too thin to respond quickly to something like this. Frank studied the motel layout again, memories of another desperate defense rising unbidden in his mind. Da Nang, 1968. Their unit trapped in a village similar to this motel's layout. A rough shape with multiple entry points and thin walls that offered little protection. We survived Cam Low Hill, Frank said quietly, his finger tracing the memories on the paper before him. Surrounded, outgunned, no support coming. The other veterans nodded, the reference immediately understood. For 3 days, their unit had held a critical position against waves of enemy attacks, using every trick and tactic they'd learned in the jungle. I remember, Doc said with a grim smile. We turned their numbers against them, created choke points, improvised traps, used their expectations against them. The Cam Low defense, Martinez nodded. We can adapt it here. The layout's similar. Frank felt a plan forming, built on decades-old battlefield improvisation, but updated for their current situation. We need to control when and where they come at us. Force them into our killing zones, not theirs. Like the ravine approach, Madison suggested, referencing another Vietnam battle. We let them think they've found a weakness, then collapse on them when they commit. Exactly, Frank agreed. But first, we need to get a better understanding of what we're facing and buy some time. He turned to Maria. You worked in their safe house. Any other information that could help us? How many men total? Who leads them? What kind of weapons? Maria hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. The main boss is called El Cuchillo, the knife. Alejandro Vega is his lieutenant, handles operations in this area. They have about 40 men assigned to this region, most with military-grade weapons. They've been expanding aggressively, eliminating anyone who won't cooperate. And the tunnels on the hard drive? Frank prompted. They connect safe houses on both sides of the border. The one nearest here comes up about 10 miles south, in an abandoned silver mine. They're moving everything through them. Drugs, weapons, people. Frank exchanged glances with his unit. The stakes had just gotten considerably higher. This wasn't just about one witness or one motel. It was about a major criminal operation establishing itself in American territory. Sierra Team, we're implementing Operation Whispering Forest, Frank decided, naming the defensive strategy they perfected in the jungle. Phase 1 is deception and preparation. We make them think we're weaker than we are, while setting the battlefield to our advantage. The veterans nodded, familiar with the approach. For the next 20 minutes, they worked with focused efficiency, repurposing everyday items into defensive tools. Jenkins, who'd worked as an electrician after the war, rewired parts of the motel's electrical system to create controlled outages. Martinez and Madison prepared improvised noise and light distractions. Thompson, with Maria's help, marked likely approach vectors on the motel map. Wilson, despite his injury, assembled makeshift alarms using kitchenware and fishing line from Frank's maintenance supplies. Doc and Frank had a quiet conversation in the corner about medical contingencies, both men fully aware that their advanced age and Wilson's injury added complications to an already dangerous situation. If this goes sideways, Frank said in a low voice, getting the girl and the intel out becomes priority 1. The hard drive could shut down their whole operation. Doc nodded. I'll prep a go bag with essentials. Martinez has the best chance of making it through if we need an evacuation. Outside, the cartel forces maintain their perimeter, occasionally firing shots at the motel to keep the defenders on edge. Through binoculars, Frank observed 3 more vehicles arriving, disgorging additional men and heavier weapons. El Cuchillo has arrived, Maria whispered, pointing to a tall figure emerging from a luxury SUV. Even at a distance, the man projected menace. Unlike the tactical gear of his soldiers, he wore an expensive suit, a stark white shirt providing contrast to his dark skin. Most distinctive was the silver-handled knife he casually flipped in one hand. "He only comes when he wants to make an example," Maria added, her voice barely audible. "They're going to kill everyone." Frank watched the cartel leader survey the motel, the knife catching moonlight with each flip. Something about the man's posture, the way he held himself, how he directed his men with minimal gestures, tugged at Frank's memory. Military training, Frank realized aloud. Mexican Special Forces, if I had to guess. "Maria," Martinez asked, "do you know anything about El Cuchillo's background?" She nodded. "I heard the other men talk. He was a commander in some special unit before joining the cartel. They fear him because he knows how to break men, techniques he learned in the military." Frank processed this information, adjusting mental calculations. A trained military opponent meant standard cartel tactics might not be sufficient. They needed to adapt. "Change of plans," Frank announced. "We're dealing with a sophisticated opponent. Sierra team, prepare for Operation Broken Mirror." The veterans straightened, recognizing the seriousness in Frank's tone. Broken Mirror had been their contingency for facing specialized enemy units in Vietnam, a counterintelligence approach designed to confuse and misdirect highly trained opponents. "Martinez, I need convincing radio chatter suggesting more personnel than we have. Thompson, coordinate with Jenkins on false sniper positions. Madison, Wilson, prepare the shadow points as we discussed. Doc, you and Maria relocate the medical station to fallback position 2. As the team executed their assigned tasks, Frank studied El Cuchillo through the binoculars again. The cartel leader was conferring with Vega, gesturing toward different areas of the motel. Frank recognized the movements of a man planning a tactical assault. 30 minutes, maybe less, Frank estimated. That's when they'll hit us. Frank's mind drifted to another mission debriefing, decades earlier. Their commanding officer pacing before them in the humid Vietnamese air. "Gentlemen, you're facing an enemy that outnumbers you, knows the terrain, and has nothing to lose. Your advantages? They don't expect you to hit back. They don't know what you're capable of. Use their certainty against them." The memory crystallized Frank's resolve. These cartel men were dangerous, well-armed, and professionally led, but they had made a critical error. They saw only a group of old veterans, not the combat-hardened Marines who had survived one of history's most brutal conflicts. "Sierra 1 to all positions," Frank called through the walkie-talkie. "Phase 2 initiates in 5 minutes. Confirm readiness." One by one, the veterans responded, their voices calm despite the danger. Each had settled into the role they'd performed decades ago, Martinez coordinating communications, Thompson providing tactical oversight, Madison and Jenkins establishing defensive positions, Wilson managing their limited resources, and Doc preparing for casualties. Maria watched them with growing amazement. "You've done this before," she whispered. "Not just in Vietnam, after 2. Frank nodded slightly. "Peacekeeping missions in Lebanon. Cartel encounters near the border after some of us joined Border Patrol. Private security work in hostile zones. The world never stopped needing soldiers, even when we tried to stop being them." Outside, El Cuchillo raised his hand, and the cartel forces began to move with practiced precision, breaking into smaller teams that spread out to surround the motel. "Contact imminent," Frank announced. "Remember, we control the engagement. Make them come to us on our terms." The first shots came moments later, coordinated fire from multiple positions, targeting the most obvious defensive locations. But the veterans had anticipated this, having placed convincing decoys at those points while positioning themselves elsewhere. Thompson triggered the first trap, a series of emergency lights that flooded the eastern approach with blinding illumination, momentarily disorienting the assault team approaching from that direction. Simultaneously, Martinez detonated a collection of fireworks they'd found in the motel's storage room, creating the impression of gunfire from the rooftop. The cartel forces hesitated, confused by the unexpected resistance and unable to pinpoint actual defender positions. Taking advantage of the confusion, Madison used the shotgun to disable the floodlights on the remaining SUVs, plunging the parking lot into near-total darkness broken only by muzzle flashes. In the darkness, the veterans' knowledge of the motel's layout became their greatest advantage. They moved between predetermined positions, firing selectively at confirmed targets before relocating, creating the illusion of a much larger defending force. But the cartel's numerical advantage began to tell. 2 men breached the western edge of the motel, entering through a window Jenkins had intentionally left unsecured, leading them directly into a prepared kill zone where Thompson waited with the hunting rifle. Frank heard the rifle crack twice, followed by Thompson's calm voice. 2 tangos down, western approach secure. The success was short-lived. From his position, Frank spotted 3 more cartel soldiers approaching the main office, using the disabled vehicles as cover. They moved with the coordinated precision that confirmed Frank's suspicion about their leader's military background. Sierra team, fall back to secondary positions, Frank ordered. They're pushing from the south. The veterans executed the planned withdrawal, maintaining fire discipline while relocating to their fallback points. Frank grabbed essential supplies from the office before retreating down the hallway, joining Doc and Maria in the conference room that now served as their command center. "How are we doing?" Frank asked as Martinez slipped in through a side door. "Thompson is running low on oxygen," Martinez reported grimly. "Wilson's wound has reopened. Jenkins is holding the east wing, and Madison is covering our north escape route. We've taken down 7 of theirs, but they keep coming." Outside, they heard El Cuchillo shouting orders, his voice carrying authority that his men instantly obeyed. The assault pattern shifted, becoming more methodical, room by room, conserving ammunition, maintaining communication. "He's good," Frank acknowledged reluctantly. "Adapting to our tactics." Doc finished changing Wilson's bandage, his experienced hands working quickly despite the decades since he'd performed field medicine. "We can't maintain this position much longer, Frank. Thompson needs medical attention, and we're almost out of ammunition." Frank nodded, the weight of command settling on his shoulders just as it had in countless jungle firefights decades earlier. His men were looking to him for a solution, and so was Maria, whose life depended on their success. "Sierra team," Frank said, his voice steady. "Implement Hail Mary protocol." The veterans exchanged glances, recognizing the code for their most desperate contingency plan from Vietnam. A high-risk counterstrike when retreat wasn't possible and defense had failed. "You sure about this, Frank?" Martinez asked quietly. Frank looked around at his old unit. Men who had followed him into hell once before, now ready to do so again. He thought of the young woman whose life was in their hands, and the communities that would suffer if the cartel established its operation here. "I'm sure," he replied, his voice hardening with resolve. "It's time we show these cartel boys what happens when you corner old Marines." The Hail Mary protocol had been born in the rain-soaked jungles outside Khe Sanh, when Frank's unit found themselves cut off from their platoon by a numerically superior enemy force. Conventional wisdom said they should dig in and wait for reinforcements. Instead, they had attacked, not directly, but by creating a series of diversions that fragmented the enemy's attention before striking at unexpected points. "Martinez, initiate south wing diversion," Frank ordered. "Thompson, coordinate with Jenkins on the electrical shutdown. Madison, prepare for first movement on my mark." Each veteran acknowledged, their voices steady despite the intensifying gunfire outside. Doc helped Thompson adjust his oxygen flow for maximum efficiency while Wilson checked and distributed their remaining ammunition. "What about me?" Maria asked, her initial fear now tempered with determination. "I can help." Frank assessed her for a moment. "You familiar with any of these weapons?" "My father was police in Nogales," she replied. "He taught me to shoot before the cartels killed him." Frank handed her his backup pistol, a compact .38 revolver. 5 shots. Use them only if absolutely necessary. Martinez had prepared their primary diversion, a series of timed charges made from the motel's emergency flares and propane canisters from the barbecue grill. Not powerful enough to cause serious damage, but sufficient to create concussive force and brilliant light. Charges set, Martinez reported. 2-minute timer. Frank nodded. Sierra team, sync watches. Operation commences at 23:17 exactly. They synchronized their watches, a ritual that transported each of them back to helicopter insertions and night raids conducted half a century earlier. For a moment, Frank could almost feel the weight of his old M16 instead of the .45 in his hand, could almost smell the jungle instead of the desert dust. Remember, Frank said quietly, we're not trying to eliminate all threats. The objective is to create an opening for Maria to reach cover in the eastern arroyo, where she'll have a clear path to the county road. Doc would accompany her, carrying essential medical supplies and the satellite phone Thompson had produced from his personal effects, previously a SEAL's device, acquired through channels no one questioned. 30 seconds, Martinez announced. Frank looked at each man in turn. His brothers, who had lived civilian lives for 50 years but had never truly left the battlefield behind. If this was to be their final mission, he was proud it would be together, protecting an innocent against overwhelming odds. Just like old times. Semper Fi, Frank said simply. Semper Fi. They echoed, the Marine Corps motto carrying a lifetime of meaning in 2 short words. The first explosion came precisely on schedule, rocking the south wing of the motel. The second and third followed in rapid succession, creating the impression of a major assault originating from within the defender's position. The cartel forces reacted predictably, shifting their attention and firepower toward the apparent threat. Through the window, Frank saw El Cuchillo barking orders, redirecting teams to respond to the unexpected offensive. Phase 2, Frank ordered. Thompson triggered the electrical shutdown, plunging the entire motel into darkness except for emergency lights at selected points. Lights that Jenkins had rewired to illuminate areas where no defenders were actually present. In the calculated confusion, Madison and Wilson moved to their assigned positions, establishing a crossfire zone that would cover the others' movement. The veterans executed the plan with practiced precision, muscle memory from countless night operations guiding them through the darkened motel. Frank led Martinez, Doc, and Maria through the conference room's rear exit, using the darkness and the cartel's diverted attention to reach the eastern wing undetected. They encountered a single guard, whom Martinez neutralized silently with a combat knife, another relic of Vietnam he'd apparently never stopped carrying. Clear to junction point, Frank reported via walkie-talkie. Sierra 3 and 4 in position, Madison confirmed from his location. We have visual on 3 tangos approaching your 20. Frank peered around the corner, spotting the cartel soldiers moving cautiously toward their position. He signaled to Martinez, who readied another diversion, this one using the motel's fire suppression system, which Jenkins had rigged to trigger on command. The sprinklers activated, dousing the approaching men and momentarily disrupting their night vision and coordination. Frank and Martinez used the advantage to eliminate 2 of them before they could react. The third managed to fire a burst from his automatic weapon before Wilson's shot from his position took the man down. Our position is compromised, Frank announced. Accelerate timeline. They moved faster now, knowing their element of surprise was diminishing. The motel's layout, which Frank had memorized over his years of ownership, provided alternative routes through maintenance areas and storage spaces unknown to the attackers. As they approached the eastern exit point, Frank spotted a problem. A team of cartel soldiers had established a position covering the planned escape route. 3 men with automatic weapons and night vision equipment, deployed with tactical awareness that confirmed El Cuchillo's military background. Sierra 1 to Sierra 5, Frank called to Thompson. We need suppression on the east exit. Copy that, Thompson replied. his breathing audible through the walkie-talkie. "But I'm down to 3 rounds." "Make them count," Frank responded. Thompson's first shot came from an unexpected angle. He had repositioned to the roof using a maintenance ladder despite his oxygen tank. The round found its mark, dropping one of the cartel soldiers. The other 2 immediately sought cover, returning fire toward Thompson's position. "Go now," Frank urged Doc and Maria. "We'll cover you." Doc nodded, his medical bag slung across his body. "See you at the rendezvous point." Frank watched as Doc and Maria made their break, sprinting toward the arroyo that would provide cover for their escape. The remaining cartel soldiers spotted the movement and shifted their fire, but Martinez and Frank had anticipated this, laying down covering fire that forced the men back into protection. Thompson's second shot eliminated another threat, leaving only one guard at the exit point. Frank exchanged nods with Martinez, and both men moved simultaneously from different angles, overwhelming the remaining soldier before he could call for backup. "Package is away," Frank reported to the team as Doc and Maria disappeared into the darkness of the arroyo. "Begin Phase 3. Phase 3 was the most aggressive element of the plan, a coordinated series of attacks designed to make the cartel forces believe they were facing a much larger and better-equipped opposition. The veterans would strike at multiple points, create the impression of reinforcements arriving, and then fall back to their final defensive position where they would make their stand. Madison and Wilson initiated the first strike, targeting the cartel's command position in the parking lot with precise fire from multiple angles. Jenkins simultaneously triggered a series of improvised noise makers along the perimeter, simulating movement around the entire motel. From his new position, Thompson used his final round to disable the radio equipment in the lead SUV, temporarily disrupting the cartel's communications. The coordinated assault created momentary panic among the cartel forces, who found themselves under attack from what seemed like a dozen different positions. Frank saw El Cuchillo shouting at his men, forcing them back into formation, his military discipline evident even in crisis. The cartel leader wasn't falling for the deception entirely. He was adapting, consolidating his forces rather than fragmenting them, as the plan had intended. "He's pulling them back to the central position," Frank observed to Martinez. "Smart move." "Too smart," Martinez agreed. "We need to accelerate our timeline." Frank nodded. "Sierra team, initiate final fallback." "Repeat, initiate final fallback." The veterans acknowledged, beginning their pre-planned withdrawal to the motel's strongest defensive position, the maintenance garage at the northwest corner. Built with concrete block rather than the wooden frame of the rest of the motel, it offered the best protection for their last stand. Frank and Martinez were the last to fall back, laying down covering fire to protect the others' movement. As they approached the garage, a burst of automatic fire from an unseen position caught Martinez in the leg, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Man down," Frank called, dragging Martinez behind a concrete planter for cover. "I'm okay," Martinez grunted, though blood was already soaking through his pant leg. "Flesh wound." Frank provided covering fire while helping Martinez to his feet. They were 30 yards from the garage entrance when another burst of gunfire kicked up dust at their feet. Before they could respond, Jenkins appeared at the garage door, laying down suppressive fire with the shotgun. "Move it, ladies," Jenkins called, the gallows humor of combat veterans unchanged by 50 years. "Or you'll miss the party." They made it to the garage, Jenkins pulling them inside as Madison and Wilson sealed the heavy door behind them. Thompson had already established a defensive position at the small window, his oxygen tank wheezing beside him. "Status report," Frank ordered, helping Martinez to a stack of tires where Doc had left basic medical supplies. "Ammunition critical," Madison reported. "Shotgun has 3 shells left. I have 4 rounds for the revolver. Wilson has 2. Thompson's down to his sidearm, 3 shots," Jenkins added. "I've got 5 in the pistol." Frank nodded grimly, quickly calculating. "That's 17 rounds total, plus what Martinez and I have left. call it 25 rounds between us. Against at least 20 men with automatic weapons, Thompson observed dryly. Almost seems unfair to them. The veterans shared a brief, tense laugh, the kind only possible among men who had faced death together so many times that fear had transformed into something else entirely. Outside, they could hear El Cuchillo reorganizing his forces. The cartel leader had clearly realized the defenders had consolidated to a single position and was preparing a final assault to overwhelm them. Doc and Maria should have reached the county road by now, Frank said, checking his watch. If they got through to Border Patrol, help could be 30 minutes out. We just need to hold that long, Martinez said, wincing as he tightened a makeshift bandage around his thigh. Frank studied the garage layout, mentally calculating angles of fire and defensive positions. The heavy tool cabinets could be moved to create cover. The inspection pit in the center offered additional protection. The small office in the corner had only one entrance, making it a fallback position within their fallback position. They'll hit us from multiple angles, Frank predicted. Probably breach the main door with concentrated fire while sending teams to the side entrance and window. Classic hammer and anvil, Thompson agreed. What they don't know is we've got the garage rigged. During their planning, Jenkins had connected the garage's hydraulic vehicle lift to an emergency override, creating a trap that could be triggered on command. The heavy metal platform would drop suddenly, creating a barrier in the center of the room while simultaneously releasing the stored hydraulic fluid, creating a slick, dangerous surface for anyone rushing in. We'll let them commit to the breach, Frank decided. Jenkins triggers the lift when the first team is halfway in. Thompson and Wilson target anyone who makes it past that point. Madison and Martinez cover the side entrance. I'll take the window. The veterans move to their positions, conserving energy and checking weapons one final time. The garage had fallen silent except for Thompson's labored breathing and the occasional grunt of pain from Martinez as he positioned himself behind a heavy workbench. Outside, the night had taken on the pregnant stillness that soldiers everywhere recognize, the calm before an assault. Frank could sense El Cuchillo organizing his final attack, could almost hear the cartel leader assigning positions and issuing orders. Sierra team, Frank said quietly, whatever happens in the next 30 minutes, I want you to know it's been an honor serving with you. In Vietnam and here. Wouldn't want anyone else in this foxhole, Thompson replied, his voice rough with emotion and exertion. Second that, Wilson added. We had a good run, Frank, Martinez said with a slight smile. 50 years longer than we expected in 68. Madison and Jenkins nodded their agreement, words unnecessary among men who had shared so much. Frank felt a familiar calm settle over him, the clarity that came with accepting that death might be imminent, but choosing to face it on one's own terms. It was a feeling he'd experienced first in the A Shao Valley, and dozens of times since, a state of mind where fear existed but couldn't dominate. The first impact against the garage door shattered the silence, a battering ram of some kind, likely a vehicle bumper. The second hit dented the metal inward. Frank knew the third or fourth would breach it completely. Steady, he cautioned as the veterans instinctively tightened their grips on their weapons. Let them commit. The third impact partially buckled the door, creating a gap large enough to see movement outside. Instead of a fourth ram, a hail of bullets poured through the opening, forcing the defenders to duck behind cover. Under cover of this suppressive fire, cartel soldiers began attempting entry through the side door and window simultaneously. Madison fired twice, dropping the first man through the side entrance, while Frank's careful shot eliminated the soldier attempting to breach the window. A final impact shattered the main garage door completely. As predicted, a team of cartel soldiers rushed the opening, weapons firing on full automatic, spending ammunition freely to overwhelm the defenders with sheer firepower. Now, Frank called when the first 3 men were inside. Jenkins triggered the hydraulic system. With a mechanical groan and hiss of pressurized fluid, the heavy lift platform dropped from its raised position, creating a barrier that separated the first wave of attackers from their support. Simultaneously, the released hydraulic fluid spread across the concrete floor, causing two of the soldiers to lose footing and fall. Thompson and Wilson capitalized on the momentary advantage, their aimed shots finding targets despite the chaos. Martinez, despite his injury, managed to eliminate another attacker attempting to flank through the side entrance. For a brief moment, it seemed the veterans might repel the assault. Then a small cylindrical object bounced into the center of the garage, trailing smoke. Flashbang! Frank warned, an instant before the stun grenade detonated. The concussive force and brilliant flash disoriented the defenders despite their preparation. Frank's ears rang painfully, his vision swimming with afterimages. Through the disorientation, he heard rather than saw the second wave of attackers breach their position. Automatic weapons fire tore through the garage, riddling tool cabinets and walls. Frank heard Wilson cry out in pain, saw Madison returning fire despite blood streaming from a wound on his forehead where shrapnel from the grenade had caught him. Fall back to the office, Frank ordered, firing his remaining rounds to cover the retreat. Jenkins and Martinez helped Thompson, whose oxygen tank had been hit, leaking precious air. Madison half-carried Wilson, whose leg had been struck by a bullet. Frank was the last to reach the office doorway, taking a round in the shoulder that spun him against the frame before he could pull himself inside. Jenkins slammed the door shut, jamming a heavy wrench through the handle to secure it. The small office offered minimal protection, but at least concentrated their defensive position to a single point. Ammunition? Frank asked, pressing a hand against his bleeding shoulder. The report was grim. Between them, they had 7 rounds left. Outside, they could hear El Cuchillo directing the final assault, positioning men to breach the office door. "Looks like this is it," Thompson said, his breathing shallow as he conserved his remaining oxygen. Frank nodded, accepting the reality but still searching for options. His eyes fell on the office's rear wall, where a small ventilation grate was partially hidden behind a filing cabinet. "That vent," he said suddenly. "Where does it lead?" Jenkins, who had helped with the motel's maintenance for years, replied, "Crawlspace under the west wing. Tight fit, though." "Thompson and Wilson can't make it," Martinez observed, stating the obvious. "And I'm not sure I can with this leg." Frank made the difficult calculation that combat leaders have faced throughout history, weighing risks, lives, and mission objectives in seconds. "Madison, Jenkins, you take the vent. Try to circle around to the Arroyo, follow Doc and Maria. Get that hard drive to the authorities. And leave you 3? Madison protested. "Not happening, Frank." "That's an order, Marine," Frank replied, his voice taking on the command tone that had served him for decades. "The mission comes first. That hard drive can shut down their entire operation, save lives across the whole region." A burst of gunfire against the door emphasized the urgency of the decision. The wood was beginning to splinter. They had perhaps a minute before it gave way completely. Jenkins and Madison exchanged looks, decades of military discipline warring with loyalty to their brothers. "Go," Thompson said firmly. "Don't waste our last stand." With reluctant nods, Madison and Jenkins moved the filing cabinet and removed the vent cover. The space beyond was narrow and dark, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. "See you on the other side, gentlemen," Jenkins said as he squeezed into the opening. "Save us some beer wherever you end up," Madison added, following him into the darkness. Frank, Thompson, and Martinez positioned themselves facing the door, weapons ready for the final breach. They arranged themselves in a triangle formation, maximizing their coverage of the entry point with their remaining ammunition. 3 rounds each, Frank noted. "Make them count." Outside, they heard El Cuchillo's voice, closer now, issuing final orders for the breach. There was something in his tone, a professional respect perhaps, that suggested he recognized the quality of his opposition. "You fought well, senors," the cartel leader called through the splintering door. "Surrender now, and I offer you a clean death. No torture, no suffering. Professional courtesy from one soldier to another. Frank exchanged glances with his remaining men, seeing in their eyes the same resolve he felt. They had survived Kisan, Cartel, Hue City battles whose names would forever be etched in Marine Corps history. They would not surrender their final battlefield to a cartel thug, no matter his military background. "We are United States Marines," Frank shouted back, his voice strong despite his wounds. "We don't surrender." A grim chuckle came through the door. "As you wish, Marines. I salute your courage, even as I end your lives." The final assault began with another flashbang, thrown through a gap in the splintering door. This time the veterans were prepared, shielding their eyes and turning away from the blast. As the door finally gave way, they fired their remaining rounds with practiced precision, dropping the first men through the breach. But there were too many, the advantage of numbers too great. As his final round found its target, Frank saw Thompson take multiple hits to the chest, the old warrior slumping against the wall with a look of peace rather than pain. Martinez managed to strike El Cuchillo's arm with his last shot before falling to concentrated fire. Frank felt bullets tear into his body as he raised his empty weapon like a club, determined to go down fighting. Through the pain and encroaching darkness, he looked directly at El Cuchillo, who had entered once the gunfire stopped. The cartel leader returned his gaze with what seemed like genuine respect, then raised his pistol for the coup de grace. The shot never came. Instead, the night erupted with the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors and powerful spotlights suddenly illuminating the motel grounds through the windows. A voice over a loudspeaker, impossibly loud, announced, "This is United States Border Patrol. The building is surrounded. All persons inside are ordered to lay down weapons immediately." El Cuchillo hesitated, genuine surprise crossing his face for the first time. In that moment of indecision, Frank summoned his remaining strength and lunged forward, tackling the cartel leader to the ground. They grappled briefly, Frank's Marine Corps hand-to-hand training flooding back through decades of muscle memory. Despite his wounds, Frank managed to pin the younger man, restraining El Cuchillo's knife hand against the floor. Their eyes met in a moment of warrior recognition, two combat veterans from different generations and opposing sides, each seeing in the other a reflection of themselves. "It's over," Frank said through gritted teeth, blood seeping from his wounds. "Your men can't fight off Border Patrol and whatever else is out there." El Cuchillo's face hardened as he calculated his options and found them wanting. Another day, perhaps, old Marie. The office door burst open again, but this time black uniformed Border Patrol tactical officers poured in, weapons trained on the cartel members. Frank felt himself being gently pulled off El Cuchillo, heard medics being called for, saw the cartel leader being handcuffed and led away. As a medical technician began working on his wounds, Frank's vision began to tunnel. Through the encroaching darkness, he saw Thompson still form against the wall, Martinez being attended to by another medic. He couldn't tell if his friend was alive or dead. "Hang on, sir," the young medic urged him. "We've got a helicopter outside for emergency evacuation. You're going to make it." Frank wanted to ask about his men, all of them, but consciousness was slipping away. His last thought before darkness claimed him was of another battlefield, another helicopter evacuation, another moment when death had seemed certain only to be denied at the final moment. Some part of him registered the irony that 50 years after Vietnam, he was once again being loaded onto a medevac helicopter, his blood soaking into foreign soil. Except this time, the soil was American, and the enemy had brought the war to him rather than the other way around. Frank awoke to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors and the antiseptic smell that was somehow both comforting and disturbing. His body felt leaden, wrapped in bandages and connected to tubes. Through the fog of medication, his first coherent thought was of his men. "Thompson," he rasped, his throat dry from the breathing tube that had recently been removed. "Easy there, Marine," came a familiar voice. Doc Reynolds sat beside the bed, looking exhausted but very much alive. His right arm was in a sling, and a bandage covered part of his forehead. Thompson didn't make it, Doc said gently. Died in the helicopter. Went out like a Marine. Frank closed his eyes, absorbing the loss. He'd known it was likely, had seen the wounds, but confirmation still cut deep. Martinez? The others. Martinez is down the hall. Lost some blood, took 2 rounds to the leg, but he'll walk again. Wilson's in surgery now, his third. 50-50 chance he keeps the leg. Jenkins and Madison made it out through that vent. Both injured, but stable. Maria's safe too. Frank nodded slightly, feeling the pull of stitches in his shoulder and chest. The cartel. El Cuchillo and 14 of his men in custody. The rest either dead or scattered. Border Patrol hit them with everything. 3 helicopters, tactical teams, even drone support. Turns out when the daughter of a former Border Patrol chief calls in a crisis, they move mountains. Maria? Doc smiled. Her father was regional chief before the cartel killed him 3 years ago. Still has friends in the agency. Once she reached the county road with the satellite phone, she made 1 call, and the cavalry came running. Frank processed this information, pieces falling into place. And the hard drive. Being analyzed by a joint FIDEA task force. Early reports say it's a gold mine. Locations, personnel, financial records. They're calling it the biggest breakthrough against the Sinaloa cartel in a decade. A knock at the door interrupted them. A tall woman in a Border Patrol uniform entered, her bearing instantly recognizable to Frank as career law enforcement. Chief Delgado, Doc acknowledged. Frank's awake. So I see. She approached the bed. Captain Delaney, I'm Regional Chief Ana Delgado. I wanted to personally thank you and your men for what you did. Maria Diaz is my goddaughter. Frank attempted a respectful nod, which his injuries transformed into a slight tilt of his head. Just defending our position, ma'am. She smiled knowingly. Is that what we're calling tactical genius these days? My agents are still trying to figure out how 7 men in their 70s held off a cartel tactical team for nearly 2 hours. We had home field advantage, Frank replied modestly. And 5 Purple Hearts, 3 Bronze Stars, and a Navy Cross between you, Delgado countered. We did our homework, Captain. Frank felt a mixture of pride and discomfort at having their military records examined. Those decorations belonged to younger men in a different war. The sheriff? Frank asked, changing the subject. Delgado's expression hardened. In federal custody, along with 2 deputies and the county commissioner. The corruption went deeper than we thought. The motel. Mostly destroyed, I'm afraid. Insurance should cover it, and there might be some asset forfeiture funds available for rebuilding, given the circumstances. Frank wasn't concerned about the building itself, just the memories it contained. For years it had been his anchor, the place where he and his unit reconnected with who they had been and who they had become. Now it was yet another battlefield left behind. Get some rest, Captain, Delgado said, moving toward the door. There will be debriefings later, but for now, you've earned some peace. After she left, Doc adjusted Frank's 4 and checked his vitals with professional efficiency. The local news is calling us the Desert Oasis 7, Doc mentioned with a hint of amusement. There's reporters camped outside the hospital. They'll lose interest soon enough, Frank predicted. Today's heroes, tomorrow's footnote. Not this time, Doc disagreed. Maria's story is going public. How her father was killed for opposing the cartel, how she risked everything to get evidence, how a group of Vietnam vets protected her when official channels failed. It's resonating, Frank, especially in the border communities. Before Frank could respond, another visitor appeared, Maria Diaz herself. The young woman looked transformed from the frightened fugitive they had sheltered. She stood straighter, her eyes clear and determined. Mr. Delaney, she said, approaching the bed. I wanted to see you before I leave. Leave? Frank questioned. Witness protection, she explained. Until the trials are over, at least. I'll be testifying against El Cuchillo and the corrupt officials. Frank nodded, understanding the necessity. You're braver than you know, young lady. She shook her head. I just did what my father would have expected. You and your friends, you're the brave ones. You fought when you could have walked away. She placed something on the bedside table. I wanted you to have this. It was a set of police badges, her father's service badges, mounted in a small frame. He would have been proud to know you, she said simply. You reminded me what courage looks like. After Maria left, Frank drifted between sleep and wakefulness, his mind processing everything that had happened. The medications dulled the physical pain but did nothing for the deeper ache of losing Thompson and the uncertainty surrounding Wilson's fate. 3 days later, Frank was sitting up in bed, watching the news coverage of the cartel arrests, when Jenkins and Madison walked in. Jenkins sported a cast on his left arm, while Madison moved carefully with the aid of a cane. You two look like hell, Frank greeted them with the affectionate gruffness of old soldiers. Speak for yourself, Captain, Madison retorted. You've got more hardware in you now than the maintenance shed. The three veterans shared a moment of quiet understanding, the unspoken acknowledgement of what they had survived together again. Wilson's out of surgery, Jenkins reported. They saved the leg. Doctor says he'll walk with a prosthetic for the lower portion, but he'll be mobile. Good news, Frank said with genuine relief. There's more, Madison added. Martinez is being discharged tomorrow, and we've had visitors, lots of them. Veterans from across 3 counties coming to pay respects, bringing food, offering help with rebuilding. Frank raised an eyebrow. Rebuilding? Jenkins grinned. You don't think we're letting the desert oasis die, do you? That's our reunion spot. Location's compromised, but the spirit isn't. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse bringing Frank's medication. After she left, the men continued their discussion in lower voices. There's something else you should know, Madison said more seriously. The DEA found 3 more cartel safe houses based on the hard drive information. They're dismantling the entire regional operation. Maria's father would be proud, Frank observed. The community's talking, Jenkins added. People who were afraid to oppose the cartel are speaking up, reporting activities they've witnessed. It's like a dam broke. It wasn't just about us surviving, Madison elaborated. It was about showing people that standing up is possible. That's the real transformation happening out there. Frank considered this. Their last stand had never been about making a statement. It had been about survival and protecting someone who needed help. But sometimes actions carried meanings beyond their intentions. A week later, Frank attended Thompson's funeral from a wheelchair, still too weak to stand for long periods. The ceremony was held at the National Cemetery, with full military honors. Veterans from multiple generations turned out alongside Border Patrol agents, local residents, and media. As the honor guard folded the flag from Thompson's casket with ceremonial precision, Frank looked at the faces of his surviving unit members. Martinez in a wheelchair with both legs bandaged. Wilson absent, still hospitalized. Doc standing solemnly despite his injuries. Jenkins and Madison flanking Frank, standing at attention despite their wounds. The 3-volley salute echoed across the cemetery, and as the bugler played taps, Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with saying goodbye to a brother in arms. They had survived the jungles of Vietnam together only for Thompson to fall on American soil, defending the same values they had fought for overseas. The funeral was followed by a community gathering at the local VFW hall. What had been planned as a small reception became something much larger as residents from across the county arrived to pay their respects. Frank found himself surrounded by people thanking him, sharing stories of their own encounters with the cartel's intimidation, expressing relief that someone had finally stood against the tide. You guys started something, a young Border Patrol agent told Frank. Communities all along the border are organizing, reporting suspicious activities, refusing to be intimidated. The cartels rely on fear and silence. You broke both. As the gathering continued, Frank noticed a group of younger veterans, Iraq and Afghanistan era, speaking with Martinez and Doc in the corner. The older and younger warriors were comparing experiences, forming connections across generations united by the shared experience of combat and return. Chief Delgado appeared at Frank's side. Quite a turnout. Frank nodded. Thompson would have hated all the fuss, but appreciated the impact, she suggested. We've had 23 local business owners come forward with information about cartel extortion efforts since your stand at the motel. People who were too afraid to speak before. And what happens when the attention fades? Frank asked. The cartel's patient. They'll wait it out, come back when the spotlight moves on. Delgado's expression was determined. Not this time. We're establishing a permanent joint task force in the region, and the community's organizing civilian patrols, communication networks, reporting systems. Your stand showed them it's possible to fight back. The chief was called away, leaving Frank to observe the gathering. He noticed Jenkins deep in conversation with a county commissioner, one of the few not implicated in corruption, gesturing as if explaining concepts. Madison had attracted a group of younger veterans who were listening intently to whatever wisdom he was sharing. Doc approached Frank's wheelchair, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Frank and settled into a chair beside him. Jenkins is pitching the commissioner on a veterans security training program, Doc explained. Teaching local businesses counter-surveillance techniques, security protocols, communication systems. Madison, organizing a veterans support network. Regular meetings, shared resources, community involvement. Says he's tired of vets sitting isolated on their porches when they could be supporting each other. Frank raised an eyebrow. They're not wasting any time. Near-death experiences have a way of clarifying priorities, Doc observed dryly. We've spent 50 years trying to leave the war behind, Frank. Maybe it's time to use what it taught us instead of just surviving it. Frank sipped his coffee, contemplating Doc's words. The skills that had kept them alive in Vietnam and at the motel, teamwork, tactical awareness, resilience, adaptability, didn't have to remain dormant between crises. They could be taught, shared, used to strengthen rather than just to survive. So what's next for you? Doc asked after a comfortable silence. Rebuild the motel? Frank had been pondering this question throughout his hospital stay. The desert oasis had been his retreat, his hiding place in many ways. Now it lay in ruins, much like the carefully constructed civilian identity he had maintained for decades. Not sure the world needs another desert motel, Frank replied. But it might need what we know, what we can teach. Doc smiled, understanding immediately. The Desert Oasis Veterans Center has a nice ring to it. Training, support, community engagement, Frank elaborated, the concept forming as he spoke. A place where veterans can reconnect with their strengths instead of just managing their wounds. Thompson would approve, Doc said quietly. Frank nodded, feeling a sense of purpose taking root, not the desperate focus of combat, but something more constructive, more healing. The stand at the motel had awakened something in him and his surviving brothers that had been dormant for too long. They had spent decades trying to forget the war, to blend into civilian life, to be something other than the warriors they had been trained to be. Perhaps their greatest service now was to remember, not just the tactics and techniques, but the brotherhood, the resilience, the ability to face overwhelming odds and find a way through. To Thompson, Frank said, raising his coffee cup. To new missions, Doc added, completing the toast. Around them, the community continued to gather, connections forming, conversations building, a transformation taking shape that extended far beyond the 7 veterans who had stood their ground at a desert motel against impossible odds. 6 months later, Frank stood on the freshly laid concrete foundation of what would soon become the Desert Oasis Veterans Center. The autumn desert sun cast long shadows across the construction site as veterans from 3 generations worked together, raising wall frames and setting roof trusses. Martinez supervised from his wheelchair, his injured legs healing but not yet strong enough for construction work. Wilson had adapted remarkably well to his partial prosthetic, moving among the workers with only a slight limp. Jenkins and Madison worked alongside Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, sharing techniques and stories across generational divides. Doc approached, handing Frank a bottle of water. El Cuchillo's trial starts next week, he said. Federal prosecutors say it's airtight. Between Maria's testimony and the hard drive evidence, he's looking at multiple life sentences. Frank nodded, scanning the horizon where Border Patrol vehicles regularly patrolled now. The cartel's regional operation had been dismantled entirely. Safe houses raided, tunnels collapsed, corrupt officials removed. They would return eventually in some form. That was the nature of criminal enterprises, but the community was no longer defenseless against them. Thompson would have enjoyed seeing this, Frank observed, gesturing to the construction site where the new center was taking shape. He sees it, Doc replied simply. In the distance, a small convoy approached, Chief Delgado's SUV leading several government vehicles. She had become a regular visitor, helping secure federal grants for the Veterans Center and coordinating security training programs. The governor's coming for the dedication next month, Doc mentioned. National media, too. Frank grunted noncommittally. The attention still made him uncomfortable, but he had come to accept its necessity. Their story had become something larger than 7 old Marines defending a motel. It had become a symbol of resistance against forces that had seemed overwhelming. The younger veterans on site called out to Frank, asking for guidance on a structural detail. He moved toward them, his body still carrying the scars of the battle, but his step lighter than it had been in years. The burden of survival that he had carried since Vietnam had transformed into something else, a purpose, a legacy, a final mission worthy of the sacrifices made. As Frank advised the young veterans on proper support beam placement, he caught sight of a memorial wall being constructed near the entrance. Thompson's name would be the first inscribed there, but the wall was designed with space for others, not just from their unit or their war, but from all conflicts where Americans had served. The cartel's defeat was undeniable, a watershed moment for the border region. Though some questioned the extent of Frank and his unit's actions, most celebrated the powerful message sent. America does not bow to intimidation. Frank, humble yet firm, quietly stepped back from the limelight, continuing duties without fanfare, steadfast in moral clarity. Their story stands as a testament to an enduring American truth, that genuine strength lies not in aggression but in preparedness, resolve, and the unwavering commitment to justice and liberty for all. What do you think about this incredible stand? Do you believe strength alone guarantees justice, or does real power lie in partnership, strategy, and bravery? Share your perspective in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping real-life stories of courage in the face of overwhelming odds.